So similar to the thyroid, I will say that anemia is not something that most practitioners, I think, do very well, neither the OBGYNs nor the midwives. And the reason is that we assume that anemia is always related to an inadequate amount of oxygen. An inadequate amount of iron. And in general, let me say, if we were to look at what are the most common causes of anemia, especially in pregnancy, you have to consider like you're growing a baby. There's a lot more demand for resources. And so there's a good reason for which we have recommended supplementing with iron in nearly every pregnancy. And every OB/GYN will have you on iron. Every pharmaceutical type prenatal will have iron in it. Even some of our favorites, including Weanatal, includes a tiny little bit of iron. It makes sense. The problem is that when you're using a synthetic iron versus something that comes from animals and all that, it's not very easily absorbed, nor is it easily utilized by the tissues. But it's a good idea. There's just far more to this anemia thing that those of us in the functional medicine space really appreciate. And when you give a person too much anemia, they get very constipated. So let's talk about some of the signs and symptoms and what we can actually do about this after we've done like a thorough workup. So this is one of the more common things that you're going to be faced with in pregnancy. Anemia can present itself early in pregnancy or postpartum in any trimester. And all that this means, anemia, the term anemia, means that you have too few blood cells, or you have enough blood cells, but many of them are poorly formed. And a person who is anemic, especially if they're severely anemic, will look very pale. You can have a lot of weakness and fatigue, and you can be short of breath, and you can have headaches. But listen, all of those things, minus maybe the paleness, are already signs of pregnancy. So how do we know? Also, many of these also reflect a thyroid dysfunction. So how do we know which it is? Well, we do know that this is the most common cause of those symptoms. There's about 2% of women outside of pregnancy walking around with anemia, and women worldwide in pregnancy are about 30% of them are anemic, and this is especially relevant to the third trimester when you have a baby that is so big and demanding so much, and all of the iron stores that you've had are now depleted, and now you're in kind of a state of like, well, what do we do? But again, it's not just iron. There's plenty of other reasons. In fact, this is a little chart or whatever table from the an ACOG practice bulletin from 2021, which is on anemia in pregnancy. And you can see that there are acquired and inherited forms of anemia. Let me go back real quick. So this is cut off a little bit, but we have the two major categories are acquired, meaning you didn't have anemia, but now you have it because of one of these reasons, and inherited, meaning you're always anemic and it's just worse now that you're pregnant. We can also classify it by mechanism. Are you not making enough red blood cells, which gets us into the iron part? Do you have too many blood cells being destroyed, like if you have sickle cell or if you have some sort of autoimmune process that is hemolyzing your blood cells? You can also classify anemia by their MCV, which is mean corpuscular volume. We have small blood cells, which is a MCV less than 80, or we have giant blood cells, macrocytic, MCV greater than 100. So when you look at this table, you can see, my gosh, there's so many different options. And the way that we work this up helps us kind of like a choose your own adventure as to where we think our attention should most likely be. One thing I do want to point out here is that when you have a vitamin deficiency, it's most likely going to present as a macrocytic anemia. And this will show up on a typical CBC. You'll see MCV. If you've got anemia and you've got a very large MCV greater than 100, then we start to think of folic acid deficiency. Forget about folic acid. This is from ACOG. Folate deficiency, B12 deficiency. These are the types of things that we really become thoughtful about. The other thing I'll say is vitamin B6 plays in here. Copper, zinc, selenium, all the stuff that you find in nature's multivitamins are going to be helpful in preventing anemia, especially if it's not coming from a synthetic form. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can see copper also shows up here. That's a microcytic anemia. The vitamin deficiencies generally present as macrocytic anemia. You can also notice that like alcohol abuse can lead to anemia. Hopefully nobody's abusing alcohol, but if you have macrocytic anemia and a person is using a lot of alcohol in pregnancy, that might be something you think about. Some of these others are a little bit harder to explain, but we're going to go through some of them here. And I think in order to do that, we need to understand what is the structure of a blood cell. So in your blood cell is something called hemoglobin. Most red blood cells are made in the bone marrow, and the hemoglobin is the part that is really the active part of the blood cell. We've got means of making energy through lactic fermentation, and we've got some other probably organelles in the blood cell, but mostly it's this big glob of hemoglobin which has 4 globulin chains. There are 4 proteins that are kind of like this little basket that can carry oxygen if there's a heme molecule in the center. So these giant polypeptide chains are really kind of at the heart of a lot of our inherited anemias. There's 6 types of globulin chains: alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, and zeta. So most adults who are not anemic and have no issues with red blood cell production have 2 alpha chains and either 2 beta chains, 2 gamma chains, or 2 delta chains. And you can see that we have different names for this. And if you do like what's called electrophoresis, you'll actually get to see how many of these globin chains are being produced. And you can see, oh, I have, hemoglobin A, that's the normal one, or like the most common one, to gamma chains, right? I should say you have 2 beta chains in addition to the alpha. You have 2 gamma chains in addition to the alpha. That's hemoglobin F. That's what fetuses have. That F stands for fetus. And they have a much greater affinity for oxygen than the other types. And then you can have A2, which is another sort of variant that is typically found in the adult population. So hemoglobin F is predominant in the fetus from about 12 to 24 weeks. After that, they start making the typical hemoglobin A, which is what most adults, which I won't say adults, most people who are born are going to have this type of hemoglobin, but there are disorders in which you may not have that. In order to make sure that you have adequate amounts of blood cells being produced, yes, iron, yes, protein, because we just talked about all these proteins that are comprising this big polypeptide complex called hemoglobin. But you also need magnesium, zinc, copper, all of the B vitamins. All of these are super important. There's plenty of other micronutrients, all of which can be obtained through food. But you have to be eating nourishing food. That's the bottom line. And that the stuff has to be absorbed, which we'll talk about in a second. So here's the process by which we make red blood cells. The other name for red blood cells is erythrocytes. You start with this erythroblast. This is the early progenitor cell. It divides, and then that division leads to these immature red blood cells called reticulocytes, and then those mature into erythrocytes, and those are the ones that are circulating and carrying oxygen for you. So as hemoglobin is being produced, the erythroblast, this big purple thing here, it divides itself in order to evenly distribute hemoglobin between the two. So if there's an issue of hemoglobin production, and that could be in the form of the heme, it could be in the form of one of the globulins, then you might actually have to divide an extra time in order to evenly distribute based on how big the cell is. You want like a nice concentration of hemoglobin, regardless of how many cells or how big the hemoglobin concentration as a percentage of the volume of the cell needs to be roughly the same. So this is why that mean corpuscular volume matters. You may have bigger cells in order to distribute more hemoglobin, or you have smaller cells in order to distribute less hemoglobin, so that each cell has the same concentration of hemoglobin. And this is why we get the macrocytic versus microcytic anemias. You can also have normocytic anemia, which was the normal MCV, which was on that table. You can go back a slide if you'd like. So it's important to understand some of these mechanisms, and I think it's also important to remember, like the reason that this deserves its own lesson is there's a variety of maternal and fetal consequences. You have a higher chance of dying, higher chance of getting infection, higher chance of C-section, higher chance of postpartum depression, postpartum hemorrhage, and cardiovascular compromise if you have anemia, especially severe anemia. On the fetal side, babies can be born small. They can have iron deficiency themselves. They can become anemic. They can have post-growth in their early weeks or months of life, and this can impair their neurodevelopment. So there's a lot of good reasons to be getting enough hemoglobin, or enough, let's say, heme from your diet. Now, whether or not, let me say, so heme iron is what we're describing there. Heme is where that iron molecule lives. So if you take it in synthetic form, it has to be probably processed in some way into a more usable form by your gut microbiome and then absorbed into the gut. When you get heme iron from food, when it's heme iron to begin with, it's from food for the most part. When you get it from that, it's more easily digested and then utilized. So you kind of like pass over the middleman when you're getting iron from your food. So what's the deal with this impaired neurodevelopment? It's kind of an interesting conundrum. So here's what this Zhang et al. In 2021, here's what they said. This is the paper here. We have this in the bibliography for you. Synaptic growth and development proteins were severely decreased in iron deficiency anemic rats. These alterations in turn retarded the neurobehavioral development such as surface writing reflex, cliff avoidance, negative geotropism, and error writing reflex, and spatial learning and memory ability. So this is in rats, but we also know that kids born to women who are not well nourished also don't do as well. So this is a little bit of a conjecture, of course, because it's rodent studies, but we're not doing these studies for ethical considerations in humans. Most of that data is just going to have to come from observational data, where we say, well, this one was anemic. How did her baby do afterwards? Or did they have meet their normal milestones throughout childhood? So here's another one with monkeys. I don't know why this is cut off here, but you can just get the idea here. We actually have issues in even the brain development in these monkeys when their mothers were iron deficient, and the monkeys, when they were born, also resulted in iron deficiency. So this is very, very interesting. We're going to talk a little bit about ferritin. This study looked at the effects of delayed cord clamping on 4-month ferritin levels. Ferritin is a molecule that reflects your iron stores. It does not contain iron, but it's produced when there's an abundance of iron in order to buffer that and actually to protect you from the potential toxicities of having iron. They also were looking at brain myelin content. Myelin is the fatty sheath that helps to improve the transmission rate of signals up and down your nervous system. And they also looked at neurodevelopment. And their conclusion was infants who received a placental transfusion had greater ferritin levels at 4 months of age compared with those with ICC. That's immediate cord clamping, as previously reported. In addition, these greater ferritin levels were associated with increased brain myelination at 4 months of age. So this is an argument for boosting up a child's iron reserves and their red blood cells simply by delaying cord clamping. My practice and Sarah's practice is, we're going to talk about cord clamping in a separate lesson, but just as like a spoiler, our practice is like, there's no need to clamp the cord unless the baby needs to be moved somewhere away from mom urgently. Like we need to do resuscitation or get the baby somewhere to help them out with, doing CPR or whatever else. So when I have a home birth, just let the baby stay attached, put the baby on mom's chest, and let all of that additional blood flow go to the baby. Eventually, the Wharton's jelly on the outside of the cord will constrict the cord anyways, and you won't be getting any more blood flow. But doing the immediate cord clamping that many of us were taught in our residency training is not, I just don't buy it. We'll talk about some of the arguments for and against in another lesson. So why is this more common in pregnancy? Of course, you're growing a baby. And most of the weight gain in your pregnancy is due to an increase in blood volume. And the body likes to maintain hematocrit, which is a reflection of the concentration of your blood serum. So the stuff that comes out of you when we cut off your arm, that is your blood plasma, the serum. That's like the volume, okay? We want that to have a specific concentration of blood cells to plasma. And so your body will need to increase production of your red blood cells in pregnancy in order to maintain the same concentration, the same hematocrit of red blood cells to plasma, given that you have an amazing increase in the amount of fluid that's circulating through your body. Plus, your fetus is going to be taking all of those micronutrients that you had in your reserves, in your bone, in your tissue, in your organs, in wherever. They're going to be taking all of that for themselves, leaving you in a state of potentially severe depletion. So when the baby is asking for more and more nutrients, that then should be a compulsion for us to increase the amount of nutrition that we're taking in. And societies around the world have known this. Pregnant women have specific diets, and it doesn't need to be something fancy. It just means nourishing foods. I can't recommend the Nourishing Traditions way of eating any more than I already have. But it's really just getting back to what are the simplest, most nutritious things that you can be eating. It does not have to be boring. You don't have to take on a fad diet. You don't even have to eliminate many foods. But when you're eating any food, make sure it's the most nourishing form of that food. So here's how we diagnose this, or at least this is how we get an idea as to whether or not we want to go deeper. Outside of pregnancy, anything less than about 12 grams per deciliter hemoglobin is going to be considered in the anemic range. You can have up to 16, and we're just going to be like, all right, you've got lots of blood cells circulating. In pregnancy, we actually have a lower threshold. So we know that you're going to be a little bit anemic, but if you get below 11 or a hematocrit of less than 33% in the first or third trimesters, we're going to be concerned. In the second trimester, we have an even lower threshold. So if it's less than 10.5 or less than 32% in the second trimester, we're going to be a little bit concerned, okay? And it's just going to, all that this means is we need to do an additional workup. You're probably already, if you're seeing an OBGYN, you're probably already taking some iron supplementation. Why isn't it working? We're going to talk about that. So here's what a complete blood count looks like. This is the blood sample you're going to give at your first prenatal visit, and then you may give more, but at least at the first prenatal visit and at that 24 to 28 week mark, we want to be looking at what is your hemoglobin, what is your, they don't have hematocrit listed here, which is interesting. Well, here's the MCV. I wanted to focus on the MCV here. This isn't a very, very typical sort of CBC. This was probably done in another country, but hemoglobin is normally reported in decigrams per liter. So this is 1 decimal point off. So this is 10 grams per liter. That would be below that 10.5, presuming that they're in the second trimester, but in the first and third trimester, this is definitely suggestive of having insufficient hemoglobin or insufficient red blood cell production. And then the next question is, okay, what's the MCV? Right? If we're going to stratify it by microcytic, normocytic, or macrocytic, and this is less than 80, so this is a microcytic anemia. This is what, we start thinking about certain things, including copper deficiency. Early in iron, so when we're talking about iron deficiency, hang on, let me go back here. Because iron deficiency is the most common, we want to make sure, okay, if it's not iron deficiency, what is it? And based on the MCV, we can get sometimes an idea. So early on in iron deficiency anemia, your MCV might be normal. It's later in the more severe or more profound iron deficiency anemia where you start to see the MCV dropping because we simply can't produce enough hemoglobin to keep up with the normal mean corpuscular volume. So those cells just start dividing more quickly. You'll also see an increase in the reticulocytes, which is those early sort of immature erythrocytes. And so the reason that giving iron to everybody isn't necessarily going to fix it is multifold. And we have to consider what is the pathogenesis of iron deficiency anemia. First, you start dropping your reserves. So you get a drop in ferritin, you get an increased total iron binding capacity, which just reflects how many circulating proteins are available to bind up iron in the blood. And so you'll see this happen first. Then you'll start to see a decrease in your serum iron. And then you're going to develop a normocytic anemia. That's the normal MCV. And then you're going to develop a microcytic anemia. Now, these don't have to happen in this order, but this is typically what I expect to happen. Meaning, if we just get a CBC and we see like, oh, it's like maybe borderline anemia, and the microcytic anemia, or the MCV is normal, it's 82. It's in the normal range. We just forget about it. Well, if you caught a total iron binding capacity, you got a ferritin, you got a serum iron, you might actually get the full story, which is what is missing in our conventional way of working this up. So if you think you have iron deficiency, I think I've made a pretty compelling argument that looking at the CBC is not enough. Iron studies like these can provide some additional information. Now, I put this up here because this is from ACOG. I actually disagree with this. I would like your ferritin to be up above 20, up above 30. If we can get it to 40, 50, that's like stellar. But they're saying if it's more than 10, then it's fine. I disagree. At least double that. at least double that. So you can see, what's going on here. If for some reason you have a very high ferritin and a very high iron level, you might also have a condition called hemochromatosis, which has to be diagnosed by biopsy. The way that we manage that, unfortunately, is just donating blood. My mother has this. My sister has this. I don't think I have it, although I do tend to have the higher range of hemoglobin and hematocrit, but I also inherited most of my dad's genes, and I take a lot of organ meats and oysters and all the stuff we always talk about. So I'm pretty dialed in from the iron standpoint, and my red blood cells have never been an issue because I have a history of being a long distance triathlete and all that. So here's where I actually emphasize, I think we need this to be at least 50 or more. So that greater than 10 is not sufficient to me. So the U.S. Preventative Service Task Force, USPSTF, here's what they say. For asymptomatic pregnant adolescents and adults, the evidence is insufficient to assess the balance of benefits and harms of screening for iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia in pregnant persons. Current evidence is insufficient to assess the balance of benefits and harms of routine iron supplementation in pregnant persons. So they're saying there's not a great reason to be screening every single person for this, and there's not a great reason to be supplementing with iron for every single pregnant woman. But this is not the practice of OBGYNs and many midwives. They are just popping you full of iron, and there are some downsides to that. They've had some RCTs in order to back up what the USPSTF recommendations are here. Various randomized controlled trials have found that universal supplementation with elemental iron at 30 to 60 milligrams daily reduces the risk of iron deficiency anemia at term. However, with no benefit to either mom or neonatal outcomes. Meaning, okay, great, so we got your iron up, but it doesn't seem to be changing anything. Maybe we're missing something in this story, but we're not willing to acknowledge that maybe we need to change a story. That's something we really struggle with in medicine. So what I take away from this is we're either misdiagnosing iron deficiency anemia, meaning we don't really know how to work it up, or supplemental iron doesn't work, or we don't understand anything about this at all, which I like to think we understand something about it. So let's go back into what other causes for low MCV do we know of? And of course, we said that iron deficiency is the most common. That's the severe kind of later stage, but you can also have thalassemias, inflammation. It could be an autoimmune process. You could have deficiency in other micronutrients like copper, zinc, and magnesium. Now, we're not talking about vitamins here. We're talking about nutrients. So think of micronutrient deficiency leading to small blood cells and vitamin deficiency leading to large blood cells. The thalassemias are an interesting group because they result from defects in the genes that code for the globulin chains. So remember we talked about the alpha, beta, delta, gamma, etc. You may have a hard time producing the alpha or beta chains, which are the two primary chains that make up the typical hemoglobin A that many of us are walking around with. If your MCV is high, okay, it's most likely vitamin B9, B12, or B6, the B vitamins. Also of note, there is a close connection between the thyroid and nearly every process in pregnancy. Hypothyroidism can also lead to an elevated MCV, so macrocytic anemia, and that requires a separate workup. So, like I've been saying, if you're looking at these systems independent of one another, you're missing out on the opportunity to actually make a person well. And if you just did a TSH and it was normal and you never did any more workup, but then a person ends up with anemia, especially macrocytic anemia, you might really be thoughtful about, hey, maybe I should go back and revisit their thyroid. That's what I do. So this is another big piece that's missing. The role of the gut can't be overemphasized, and it's never talked about, at least not in my the OBGYN space. So here's how this works. You take iron into your mouth, and then there's ferroportin, which is a transport protein within the cells lining your intestines that will uptake iron. This is in the first part of your small intestine. And then it'll pass it off to a protein circulating in the blood called transferrin. But in order for iron to be consumed, you have to have plenty of acid, okay? And iron once it goes into your mouth, as soon as it reaches the small intestine, it's being grabbed by something. in order to keep it from leading to toxicities and hopefully not leading to constipation either. But this interaction with ferroportin is what the bioavailability piece is all about. So when you take synthetic iron, there's not a great affinity for ferroportin. When you take heme iron, when you get it from your food, that has it just flows right through this process, okay? In the blood, iron is never unbound, and in tissues, it's never unbound. It is otherwise very highly toxic. And this is most likely the role of ferritin as like a buffer for this toxicity. And the last thing, let me just, here, we'll go back to, we'll talk about iron infusion in a second. So my approach to the workup and actually the early treatment of anemia, especially iron deficiency anemia, is getting all of these things through whole food. You can do that easily with organ meats, specifically beef liver, smoked oysters, bone broth, cod liver oil, and eggs. You're going to get all of this stuff. And I haven't even, there's plenty of other nutrients that are responsible here. Optimize gut health, optimize thyroid function. The gut health thing is especially relevant if you have low ferritin in the setting of anemia. That means that you have poor iron reserves in your body, and that means that the baby is going to be struggling to make all of those new blood cells as that baby's growing. The baby's like rapidly expanding in size, and the baby needs to maintain their own hematocrit. So they need lots of nutrients to make as many blood cells as they can to keep up with that increased blood supply. So when I see low ferritin, I want to think, is there a gut dysbiosis? Is there some gut inflammation? What's happening there? Are they making enough HCl in order, or taking enough acidic foods with their meat and their potatoes and really any meal in order to enhance absorption? Even if you're taking supplemental iron, taking it down with a glass of lemon water is really, really good idea. Especially, if you're taking your prenatal or whatever, take it with some lemon juice. That'll help with the iron absorption. Iron infusion and blood transfusion are possible in pregnancy and postpartum, but they're a last resort, and that's because there is quite a bit of potential disadvantages or even adverse effects that can happen here. This got cut off again here, but oral iron versus IV iron. IV iron is generally contraindicated in the first trimester. It's effective for most people. There's a rapid correction to the anemia within like a week or two. You should be back, on board. It is weight dependent as well as and the amount that you get is also considerate of. Let me start that over. The amount that we infuse is dependent on your weight in kilograms, as well as your starting hemoglobin and the goal hemoglobin. And so we want to use the minimum effective dose. This can be very, very expensive if you're paying out of pocket. Most insurance companies won't do this unless you've tried virtually everything else. You can give like up to about a gram of elemental iron in a single infusion. That's 1,000 milligrams. That's a lot, and that will help make a lot of blood cells. The issue, of course, here is that we're doing something intravenous, and you can't take it out once it's in the blood. You can't take it away. There's a small chance, albeit a real chance, of allergic or infusion reactions. You need in a special infusion center with special personnel, and you have to have all of the tools there to treat one of these allergic reactions. So, another plus to this is we don't have to wait to see the results, and you don't get the GI side effects. You'll see up here that GI side effects are very, very common with oral iron, especially constipation. It can be kind of inflammatory to the gut. It can throw off the gut microbiome, especially the synthetic versions. But I think it's important to note that we actually don't have a ton of data showing that one of these is superior to the other, which is why IV iron should be reserved for that last ditch effort to try to get a person's blood count up, especially as they approach their birth if they have low reserves. So here's my little sort of thing here. The only downside of doing an iron infusion is that it doesn't address the root cause. So you don't really have a plan going forward. You're just saying, well, we're going to boost you up. It's like putting a piece of chewing gum on the leaking part of your boat. Like there's still a hole there. So what are we going to do about that? On the other hand, anybody who gets an iron infusion is going to feel freaking amazing.